In this video, we'll see how to create a function that counts the number of records returned by a query. The context for this example is a small family counseling practice that schedules appointments for its clients. Ultimately, we'll want this function to be able to receive a counselor name and a day and return to us the number of appointments that are scheduled for that counselor on that day. But let's start with an overview of what functions are. So in Oracle, a function is just a statement that returns a single value. And so one of the built-in functions is Sysdate. Sysdate just gets the current time from the system clock. And we can see that value by saying select Sysdate from, and then any table that would give us some records to bounce that function off of. Fortunately, Oracle provides one called dual. That's just a table that you can always count on being there that has one column and one row. And so this should give us back one value. All right, so now that's a built-in function, but let's go ahead and create a function of our own. Here's how we do it. We say create function, and then we give it a name. Our function is going to be extraordinarily simple. It's only going to return the number 7. And of course, this syntax would work just fine as it is, but if there's already a function named 7, we'll need to either drop that function first or modify the syntax to say create or replace function 7. And now we're ready to get down to business on the function. The first thing we have to do when we're establishing a function is we have to say what the return type is going to be. And so we say return, and then we say a data type that indicates what type of value this function is going to return. And now we define what the function does. We begin by saying the keyword as, and then we have we'll start a begin end block with the keyword begin. Because this function is so simple, all we have to do is specify the value that it's going to return. And so we use the keyword return, and we put the value that it will return, followed by a semicolon to complete that line. We're now done with this function, and so we will put the end block on, and we will execute the create function statement. It tells us the function was created okay, and now we can look at the results of that function in a similar way to the way that we looked at the value of the built-in Sysdate function. And so we'll just say select the name of our function, 7, from dual. And there it is, 7. Doesn't matter how many times we run it, it's always going to return the value 7 because it just returns a constant. Not a very useful function, but it does show us the bare bones requirements for being able to build a function. All right, so let's move on to build a function that can return the number of records from a query. So we'll create a replace function again, and this one we'll call appointment count. We'll establish the return value is going to return an integer, and we'll go ahead and start that function. Now in this case, because we're going to read the value from the result of a query, we're going to need to create a variable. And so we do that just before the begin block. So right here, we'll create a variable. We'll just give it a name, v_count. I like to prefix my variables with v underscore, so when I'm looking at the code, I can tell, oh yeah, that's something that I've created. It's just a variable. And we give that variable a data type. This is just going to be the number of records, and so an integer will be just fine. And we put a semicolon. Next, we say we're ready to begin the work of the function. And so we're just going to have a query here, select count from appointment. But what we need to do, since we're not displaying that count to the screen, is we need to read that value from the count into the variable. And so we'll come right after the function that we're trying to capture the value from, and we will say into the name of our variable. And then we'll have the rest of that query. So that will execute the query, and whatever the count is, it will put that into our variable vCount. So now all we have to do is return that variable. So we will return vCount and conclude our function. We'll go ahead and execute the create function statement, and we're ready to test this function out. So we'll select the name of our function, appointment count, from dual. And that tells us that there are 131 appointments in the appointment table. So now we'd like to have something that's a little bit more flexible. And that is, we'd like to be able to create a function that allows us to specify some characteristic about the data that we want to count and have it return that number. And so in this case, we want to be able to specify the name of a counselor and a date and have it return how many appointments there are for that counselor and that date. So if we're just taking a look at the data we're working with, this would be the one that we're trying to look for. So we're just going to select all the records from the counselor table where the counselor is Darrell Cooper and the date is June 1st, 2016. This function trunc allows us to take a date time and back it off just to refer to the date. And so we don't care what time these appointments start as long as they start sometime on June 1st. And here's the list. He's got 4 appointments. And so we'd like to create a function that allows us to count these records, but allowing us to specify both the name of the counselor as well as the date where the start time is. And so let's go ahead and rebuild our function. So create or replace function appointment count. But now, because we're going to specify values, we have to set up parameters, some way to receive those values coming into the function. So we'll put an opening parenthesis, and then we'll put the name of a parameter. So here it'll be a parameter to specify which counselor we're interested in knowing the count of appointments for. I like to prefix my parameter names with P and an underscore, so that when I look at it, I say, that's a parameter, a value that was passed in. Now I give it a data type as well, but for the parameters, I don't have to be very specific. All I have to do is say the category of data type. I don't have to come all the way and say varchar 20 or varchar 30. Varchar is enough. And so I'll create another parameter to hold the day. Well, notice these are both variable length character strings, even though that day ultimately will need to be a date. We'll do that work inside the function. So I'm expecting two collections of characters, one to specify the counselor and one to specify the day that we're interested in counting. And we'll close off the list of parameters with a closing parenthesis. Now we establish the return type for the function. So this is going to return an integer. And we get down to building it. So we'll say as, and that takes us into the block where we specify our local variables. So just like we did before, we'll need to create a variable to hold the count. So I'll declare that one as the count. I'm also going to create one to hold the date as a date. Now the point is that we'll be receiving the day in this parameter called p_day, but it'll be a collection of characters. We will then convert that collection of characters into the date type and hold it in this variable vDate. So let's get down to work. We'll start by doing the conversion on that date. So we'll say that our variable date, vDate, gets assigned to, and then we'll use the toDate function to convert the value that's passed in the parameter, so whatever the user has passed in, pday, and we'll give the toDate function a mask to be able to know how to convert that variable. It just means we'll have to specify this in the day, and then the 3 letters to specify the month, and then 4 for the year. Now that we have that established, we can go ahead and create the query that's going to return the records that we're going to count. So we will select the count star into our vCount variable, just as we did before, from the appointment table, where the truncated start time, so the day from the start time, is equal to our date, vDate. And counselor is equal to the counselor that was passed in. So that establishes the query now that will return the count of records just for a particular date and a particular counselor. Now we're ready to establish the return value for this function, and we're just going to return the vCount variable because that's where we've collected the result of the query. And so we'll close off this function and we'll execute the create function statement. Now that function's been created, we should be able to see how it works. So we'll select appointment count. This time we've got to specify values for those two parameters. And so we'll open the parentheses and specify Gerald Cooper. We'll then specify the day that we're interested in counting for. We'll close the parentheses for the appointment count function, and we'll specify that we want to select this from dual. Now we're ready to execute that and see what it returns. And there, in fact, is the count of the records that we specified in the prior example. And so that's how we create a function to be able to accept parameters, use those parameters to query the database, and then return a result based on that query.